All right, we got Steve Dace on the line from Michigan Podcast. I encourage you to check out his weekly podcast. They're talking Michigan football, Michigan athletics across the board, and we know what the Wolverines are doing here in March on the basketball court. Steve, we talked about it last time we got together. While we're turning back time and looking back a few years to the Brady Hoke era, of course, 5-7 was the final season there for Hoke and company. Jim Harbaugh steps in, instant credibility and upgrade to the win total, despite it being much of the same players on the field. He brings in much of his talent, which is supposed to be a step above, a cut above what was there with Hoke, which wasn't awful, certainly, and got the results the first 2 years. Then people were expecting another upgrade this past season. And so the win-loss total takes a hit for the first time in going back to an 8-5 football team. But the foundation, the structure's in place. We've had that conversation if you look at tangibles. But if you think perception and narrative, maybe that hurt them in regards to where they stood a couple weeks out from National Signing Day versus where they were at the conclusion of National Signing Day and Harbaugh's inability to close on some of the top players.
I don't think there's any question about that. And they're off to an excellent start in the class of 2019. They were off to a good start in 2018. And then they got that narrative, which they enabled with their own performance on the field, ended up crushing them down the stretch. They're off to a better start in 2019 than they were in 2018. But the same thing will happen down the stretch of this recruiting class if this season goes this fall the way last season did as well. And, you know, Coach Harbaugh, you live by the narrative, you die by the narrative. He masterfully used media narratives to get to jumpstart a Michigan program and probably move us a couple of years ahead of schedule based off of the hype, the expectation, and those players that had not won a lot of games under Coach Hoke the previous 2 years, realizing, hey, we've got to step up. We have to meet this expectation level. And I think now we've reached the point, though, where the narrative, you can no longer build it with advanced hype now. Now the narrative is simply about your record, and it will ultimately be determined on the field. I think if Michigan has a breakthrough season this fall, I think it's possible, even though it still may be a smaller class, because we still are scheduled to have a lot of guys back in 2019 as well. But I think it is possible in terms of its average star rating that this could potentially be the best class Jim has signed yet. And when you look at coaches at the same school where they have recruited the last 3 full recruiting classes, in terms of their average point total in each class, according to the 24/7 composite ratings, Nick Saban is the only coach whose 3-year, and Urban Meyer are the only 2 coaches whose 3-year average point total is better than Jim's. So when I say if they're good on the field this fall by average star ranking, this might be his best class yet. I think that says something. But if they struggle, Mark, to win significant games, I think you'll see this class collapse at the end the way the last one did. So there's a lot riding on this fall. I think that goes to why Jim was not complacent at all. I mean, it's kind of funny. You know, you and I talked all of last summer about how I thought Michigan was the most fascinating team in the preseason because of the amount of personnel losses they had. Jim was going to try and rebuild on the fly with 2 classes, the way we've seen Urban, Saban, Dabo, and others do when they've had 4, 5, 6, or 7 classes. And could he do it? And most observers didn't think he was going to do it. They probably had the record most people thought they were going to have last season, but the narrative is so negative, as you just said, that even though they probably had the same the expectation level most people expected him to have, because of where that narrative is at, it is working against him. And now the only way to beat the narrative is scoreboard, and they're going to have to win some meaningful games on the field. I saw one handicapper, Brad Powers, who used to work for Phil Steele. He's got Michigan's 2018 football schedule according to his power ratings. He's got them the 3rd toughest in the country. They're playing 5 of the top 12 teams in the preseason ESPN FPI for this fall. So here's what I'm kind of hoping. In many respects, this reminds me, if you know, which of our listeners and viewers are old enough to remember this, is, you know, at the end of the Gary Moeller era, Mueller had top 10 preseason teams loaded with NFL guys, and he went 8-4 both those years. And then he got fired in May for a drunken outburst at a Detroit restaurant. But he really didn't get fired for a drunken outburst, Mark. He got fired for having a drunken outburst after going 8-4 2 years in a row. All right? If he had gone 10-2 2 years in a row, they would have given him some counseling, and he might still be coaching at Michigan. All right? That's why he gets fired. And then Lloyd Carr takes over, and he loses 4 games his first 2 years. And there was Michael Bradley, who's a Michigan grad and was a very prominent college football writer in the late 90s, early 2000s. He wrote the cover story for the 1997 Sporting News College Football Preview, and it's titled "M Stands for Mediocre." And it was about how Michigan's program is declined, it's past its prime. The Schembechler era has played itself out. They need to reinvent themselves. 4 straight 4-loss seasons, and the schedule they were playing that year was considered impossible. 7 of their 11 teams on their schedule that fall were in the Sporting News Top 25. They opened the year with Colorado, whom Sporting News ranked number 1 in its preseason magazine that year. And so they had sort of pronounced this time of death on the Wolverines. We didn't know who Michigan's quarterback was going to be. We had seen some early flashes from Scott Dreisbach, but then he couldn't stay healthy. Brian Griese was almost out of school for an off-the-field incident, and then came off the bench to beat Ohio State with 1 throw, but then was not very good in the bowl game against Alabama, which was the Outback Bowl, by the way, or the Hall of Fame Bowl back then. So a lot of eerie coincidences. That team took all of that criticism personal. And they came out opening game of the year against Colorado and sent a message. And, that's the last Michigan team to win a national championship. So I'm hoping it's that. If it's not that, then, this is the kind of season where if it goes the other way, I think people are going to rightfully question whether he can get it done here. And there'll be even more pressure on them heading in to his 5th year in 2019. So there's a lot riding on this season, no doubt, Mark.
Steve, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but what I remember about Scott Dreisbach is his game-winning touchdown pass against Virginia in an August game at the Big House. So that was 1995?
Correct.
1995.
Yeah, in fact, that was the first time in Michigan's history, Mark. They had never come back, despite being the winningest program of all time. They had never overcome a deficit of more than 14 points in the history of their football program, if you can believe it. At that point in time, they were down 17-0 in the 4th quarter. Okay. I remember that game. It was the Pigskin Classic, earliest start ever for a Michigan football season. I think it was August 26th. It was approximately 175 degrees in the shade that day, Mark. It was scalding hot.
Okay, I'll believe you.
Kicked. I looked at my buddy, and I'm like, why are we sweating our nards off? Let's go. We went into the air-conditioned tent out on the concourse for the M-Den just to check out. Michigan had just become the first school to sign an apparel deal with Nike. And that was the year that the swoosh debuted on our uniforms, was that year. And we went in there to get some AC and to check out the new Nike stuff. When we come out, there's a loud roar. So we figured, okay, Michigan got their pity touchdown. They won't get shut out. And we decide to get something to drink. 10 minutes later, there's another loud roar. And we're like, crap, I think we just scored again. So, man, we hauled rear end to get back in that stadium so we could see the very end when he hit Mercury Hayes in the corner of the end zone on the last play of the game. And, the biggest play of that game actually wasn't Mercury Hayes' touchdown. Early in that drive, Scott Dreisbach was under pressure. He was looking to dump the ball off, and he tried to dump the ball off to a young receiver wearing number 1 named Tyrone Butterfield. And he had butter fingers. It hit him right in the hands. If he had caught that ball, he would have been tackled in the field of play. We had no timeouts. We probably would have lost the game right there. That could go on to be one of the greatest incompletions in the history of Michigan football right there.
I somehow remember that name, and I also remember it just being a beautifully, from the perspective that the final touchdown was shot overhead by ABC, from the passing hand of a left-handed quarterback. It was just a beautiful throw from near the left hash all the way across the field to the right corner of the end zone. And
Mercury Hayes barely got 1 foot in bounds. And that was how Dreisbach began his career. 2 weeks later, they went down and played Illinois in Champaign, who had Kevin Hardy and Simeon Rice. And that was supposed to be their best team. And Michigan mauled them. And it looked like we were off to a great start and then kind of fell apart. He got injured. We did end up beating Ohio State at the end of that year when Terry Glenn had said, Michigan, who's Michigan? No one cares about Michigan anymore. And Charles Woodson kind of locked him down when they were number 2 in the country. But then we lost the bowl game to Texas A&M that year in the Alamo Bowl. And that's kind of the same season we had in 1996 as well. Got up to a good start, then lost, then struggled again at the end of the year. Finally came back. We beat Ohio State. That was the biggest underdog victory in the history of that series at the time. Michigan was a 16.5-point underdog and won that game straight up, 13-9 in Columbus. And then we go down to the Hall of Fame now at that bowl, and we lose to Alabama in a real ugly offensive display. So there's a lot of similarities. But let me say this though too. In 2012, we lost to South Carolina in a close Outback Bowl. The next year, one of our very first games, we went on the road at Penn State, got destroyed 31-0. And that was sort of when you started to realize maybe this Hoke era thing isn't going to quite work out. And that's, where do we open up this season? At Notre Dame. So I think a lot of Michigan fans are very anxious and worried to find out where we really are. Because when you play a schedule like we're playing, everything will be revealed, Mark. You're not going to be able to cosmetically rack up a record when you're playing 5 of the top 12 teams in ESPN's preseason FPI. That's half your schedule almost.
All right, Steve, what I hope to be our last portion of the conversation is going to turn out to be a tease. So we are always welcoming Steve Deace from Michigan Podcast on to talk Michigan football. We, of course, are headed towards spring football and then a bit of a lull before we get to August camp. We've got a number of fun conversation pieces to toss Steve and a number of our media contributors. So for Steve, we'll put this one on ice. Best win of all time in regards to your fandom of the Maize and Blue, and then also the most crushing, excruciating loss. Regardless of championships, whatever was on the line, it didn't matter. Just whatever hit home for you as you now cherish Michigan victories or the ones that still sting. And I'll let you sit on that. I know you can talk about that anytime, but unfortunately I've run out of time, and we'll catch up with that sometime soon, Steve.
Sounds good, Mark. Thank you. Go Blue.
Thanks, Steve.